guys, we're back with some more content for the Edexcel A-Level Geography, and it's paper 3. In this video we're going to be looking at the 18 markers. Now this is our first evaluate question within the paper 3 paper, and it's challenging. They're more challenging than the analyse questions, because not only do you have to analyse, you have to show that skill of analysis, you've also got to try to evaluate, and the evidence that you're using has to come from the resource pack. Now the easiest way to think about 18 markers is that they're just like 12 markers, but there's slightly more emphasis on engagement with the data, and also you do probably need a conclusion for these as well. So what that means is you're going to construct your paragraphs in exactly the same way that you'd construct your paragraphs for a 12 marker in paper 1 and paper 2. Only this time, obviously, we've got to show that skill of using the data that we've been given to formulate our response. So what that means is when it comes to planning for the 18 marker and then actually implementing it, we're using very, very similar skills as we know how to use. So the advice that I give a lot of my students is you can almost do a pre-plan before you even look at the data set. So that's step 1. Read the evaluate question and think about, if I didn't have this data set, what would my response be? If I had to use my own knowledge, what would my response be? Now what this does, it gives us a lens with which we can analyse the data. What we're doing is we've already formulated our argument based on our own knowledge, based on our geographical knowledge. And what we're doing when we look through the data pack is trying to find evidence to back up the points that we've already made. And then as you start to comb through the data a little bit more, you'll generate some more ideas for some points. And then what we have to do, when we've worked out what data that we're going to use from the data pack, we have to think about constructing a paragraph from that. So the best way to score well in an 18 marker is to construct your paragraphs in a certain way that will show the competencies that are needed to move through those level brackets. Because we're aiming for level 3, aren't we? That's what we want to be doing in our paper 3, is trying to hit that level 3 bracket. So what does a typical level 3 paragraph look like? Well, just like if you were doing a 12 marker in a paper 1 or paper 2, you start out with a clear point. And then, just like you would in a normal 12 marker, what you would do is you would provide evidence. But this time, the evidence is coming from the resource to back up the point that you've just made. Now, in addition to this, you've also got to show the skill of analysis that you've used in 8 markers. And in most of these questions, it will probably be enough to just do a small significance calculation. So something along the lines of, this is 10 times greater than this, or 90% of the data that we observe in this particular category is above this level. Something along those lines that show you've manipulated the data a little bit. And what we've got to do, we've got to explain it away, haven't we? We've got to explain, linking it to the theory that we've studied as part of the wider specification. So something like the Kuznets curve, or modernization theory, or dependency theory. We've got to bring these into our paragraphs to show that we know this stuff and to show that we can link it to real world data. Then the best responses will also back up the point further with another bit of evidence from another area of the resource pack. And what this shows is you can use multiple different points of data to back up the same point. It shows a higher level of analysis and a higher level of evaluation. And once again, you would link that to theory just as you have with this point above. And obviously don't forget to analyse as well. Then our final point, again, as we would in a normal 12 marker, we make that link to the question. Now the students that want to perform really well in these 18 markers will then also engage in a little bit of a critique of the data that we've used as evidence. And a summarising statement, something along the lines of, but the point that we've just made could be weakened by the fact that, well, the data shows us this, but it doesn't necessarily show us this, which means that our argument is valid, but the strength of it could be called into question when we consider the weaknesses of the data set. Now this again is what paper 3 is all about. It's about data. It's about thinking of using those coursework skills that we've already utilised. We're critiquing the data, which those of you that did the best in your NEAs will have done anyway. So it's a skill that we're familiar with. Then obviously, and using exactly the same paragraph structure, we would bring in our counter argument, because that is the skill of evaluation. You can't leave that evaluate question without providing balance, otherwise you're going to get a very low score indeed. Doesn't matter how well you structure your paragraphs, if you don't evaluate, you are going to leave with probably a level 1 response. So let's have a look at this in action. What I'm going to take you through now is a typical evaluate question from a paper 3, and then show you the ways in which you can write, show you this paragraph structure in practice. Let's take a look now. So something like this would be your typical 18-mark question. Evaluate the view that to be effective, the mitigation of climate change requires many contrasting strategies. So already before you even start the combing through of the resources in section B, you can start to think about pre-planning. So what do I actually think about this? Well, yeah, to a certain degree, you can say that contrasting strategies are needed because we're dealing with the global commons here. On the other hand, how many strategies are actually at our disposal? Do we just get this big mix that isn't necessarily working at any scale? Are we wasting money in many places. All of this needs to be considered in our essay, and then we can look at the resource with that lens. So it's asking us to look at section B, and that's the entirety of section B. So you know from obviously what I've said before about 18 markers that you need to think about using multiple figures, but not just multiple figures within section B. If you want to score highly, you're going to have to use multiple sections throughout, so maybe you'll take something from section A as well. So let's have a look at section B first. So as we scroll down to section B, we can see that we've got mitigating climate change as our heading. So what we've got here is global fossil fuel usage by sector, and that data is from 2019, so it breaks it down nicely. Now remember, with your analyze questions, you pick out the headline data. What is this data actually saying about where CO2 emissions come from, and what can we use it for in the essay that we're about to write in our 18 marker? So from this immediately we can point out, well, look at all the different areas that CO2 emissions are coming from. That is something that we can use in our answer. We can say that because of all the different areas that CO2 emissions come from, that is some kind of evidence that would suggest that we need a range of strategies. And then we've got information here in figure 6 that shows the different ways of mitigating climate change. And we've got some nice data down here on the power density that is created by renewable energies. You can then zoom out a little bit further, and then we go down here and there's other ways of mitigating climate change, like extracting CO2 from the atmosphere. And that's it really in section B. So the 18 marker, as a bare minimum, would like you to refer to figures 5, 6 and 7. Now those of you that are aiming for a higher mark, this is when you can think about bringing in the information in section A. So we've got land use change data, which we could potentially use there, and maybe even forest cover data that we could potentially bring in some way, shape or form. Because remember, all we're trying to do is show that competency of we can use multiple resources to formulate our argument. And then remember, as we're combing through our data and trying to find the data that supports our arguments, we can then do is start to bring in those skills of analysis as well. So what we've got here is a pie chart with a number of percentages. So we can even add up these percentages and say that the sources from X, Y, and Z add up to this. So this percentage of emissions come from these particular sectors. Or we could say that one sector is maybe 10 times larger than another, or we're trying to manipulate that data and still show those skills of analysis to the examiner. In addition to this, remember, we're also critiquing the data set. Obviously this is very useful to us and it shows us the percentages, but what doesn't it show us? That's how we can start to bring in our critique. So this is all well and good. Why don't we see this in action, actually written in a model response? So here is our model response. So it's got everything that we need within this paragraph. So we've got a paragraph and then we've got a counter argument. It starts out with a clear point. Climate change needs multiple strategies because emissions come from many different sectors with different causes. Figure 5 shows that power generation uses 25% of global fossil fuels, while industry accounts for 21%, agriculture and land use 24%, and transport 14%. This means the top 4 sectors alone make up 84% of fossil fuel usage. So that right there is what I was talking about in terms of your data analysis. Power generation alone uses more fossil fuels than buildings, transport and agriculture do individually, more than 4 times the share of buildings. So again, we're getting in that data analysis, we're getting in that data manipulation, we're showing the examiner those competencies. So not only are we taking that data and just quoting individual parts of that data set, we're molding it and merging it to better formulate our argument. These differences show why one-size-fits-all solutions won't work. Transport needs electric vehicles, while agriculture might require further land use changes that have already taken place at rapid rates, as seen in figure 2, which shows a 5-fold increase in habitable land that is now farmed since 1700s. So as you can see there, what I've done is I've brought in an earlier figure as well. So not only am I looking at section B, which the examiners told me to look at, I'm also bringing in areas of the resource booklet that I've not been told to look in, and that shows a greater level of skill and a greater level of evaluation. And then at the bottom here, what you can see, however, the data in figure 5 doesn't show CO2 emissions directly, only fossil fuel use. So we don't know how efficiently each sector burns these fuels. This limits how precisely we can target solutions. So once again, as I've said before, find a way of critiquing the data if you can. If you don't do it in every paragraph, just do it once. And again, it's showing that high level of evaluation with respect to evaluation when you've considered a resource. The counterpoint as well takes on exactly the same structure. So however, to counter this viewpoint, this is a really good idea if you want to signal to the examiner that you're being evaluative. So using too many contrasting strategies could make action less focused and more expensive, reducing economic viability in the long term. But remember, you can use your wheel of AO2 in these responses as well. Figure 7 shows some very extreme strategies like placing mirrors in space or injecting aerosols into the stratosphere, both forms of solar radiation management. These ideas have not been properly tested and may cause unknown side effects. Carbon capture and storage, which involves pumping CO2 into deep rock layers, currently costs between $100 and $250 per ton. This means that CCS is at least 10 times more expensive than some renewable energy transitions. So once again, showing the significance of just how expensive it is. From an economic geography view, this supports the Kuznets curve idea. So again, we're bringing in that theory. Wealthier countries may reduce emissions through growth and innovation, while poorer ones may not be able to afford expensive solutions. One problem with Figure 7 is that it groups proven natural strategies like growing forests with speculative and unproven technologies, which reduces the clarity of the comparison. A better version would separate them and include data on risk and effectiveness. So there we have it. You've seen it in action. Now it's easier said than done. Obviously you've got to practice looking at the data and figuring out how you're going to formulate your paragraphs based on the data in front of you. So it's establish what data you're going to use, find a way of analysing it, bringing out the significance, show off those higher level analysis skills, use theory to explain this, bring in another bit of data as well that's from somewhere else in the resource pack, and then finally make a conclusive statement. But on the end, just say, oh, that point I've just made, how strong is it when we consider the data set? So remember guys, it's all about style. The examiner marks you based on style and marks you based on the competencies that you can demonstrate in your paragraph. So to summarize, as long as you're answering the question and your paragraphs take on this form, then you will score highly in your 18 markers. You make a clear point. Back it up with evidence from the resource pack. Make sure that you include those analysis skills like X is 10 times Y. Make reference to some sort of theory from geography from anywhere in the specification, from papers 1 and papers 2, maybe something like the Kuznets curve. Try and bring in another piece of evidence from somewhere else in the resource pack that also backs up the point that you're making to show that you can use multiple bits of data to back up the same argument. And you want to summarize your argument, linking back to the question in some way, shape or form. And then this point here, critiquing the data, shows that you can evaluate in a sort of AO3 style way, where you're critiquing the data, just like you did in the earlier 4-mark question. You can use this structure, whether it's arguments in favour of the view, or when you're putting forward your counter argument as balance and to show that you're evaluative. So give it a go. It all takes practice, and the more you practice doing this with unseen data sets, the better you will become at this particular skill. Again, if you need help with any of this, I am running my masterclasses on Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. Tuesday is 18 marker day, and it'll be a really good day because the skills that we use can also help you in the 24 mark questions as well. Thanks very much for tuning in again. Hope you found this useful.